Ever wake up to the sound of footsteps, knowing no one else should be there? That's how my nightmare started. The Adirondack forest stretched dark and silent around me. My RV parked in a secluded clearing miles from the nearest campground. It was the perfect place to escape, so I thought. It was around 2 a.m. when I first heard it. A faint crunch of leaves, then another. I shot up from the tiny bed, heart pounding. My first thought? A deer, maybe a bear. But as I sat in the stillness, the sounds became deliberate, slow, calculated steps circling my RV. Grabbing my flashlight, I peeked through the window. My breath caught. There he was, standing just outside the tree line, barely illuminated by the moonlight. His face, scarred from cheek to neck, was locked in a grin too wide to be friendly. He stood motionless, like a hunter waiting for the right moment. Panic surged as I realized my RV was the only thing separating me from him. No cell service, no neighbors, just a man who had no reason to be there. My throat went dry, and a single question echoed in my mind. Asterisk, how the hell am I going to survive? This, asterisk. My name's James Calloway, and in 2004, I decided I needed a break from everything. After years of working as a mechanic in a busy shop, the grind was wearing me thin. I'd spent more weekends fixing other people's problems than enjoying my own life. So, when I got a rare week off, I made a decision that would change my life. I packed up an old RV I'd borrowed from my brother-in-law and headed out to the Adirondack forest. A week of solitude sounded perfect. No customers, no ringing phones, no exhaust fumes. Just me and the great outdoors. The Adirondacks had always fascinated me. Towering trees, crystal-clear lakes, and trails that went on forever. It was exactly the kind of peace I'd been craving. After driving for hours down winding roads, I found a spot that felt just right. A small clearing tucked away off an unmarked dirt road. The area was so remote it didn't even show up on my map, and that's what I loved about it. No other campers, no noisy kids playing music, and no cell service to ruin the vibe. It was perfect, or so I thought. The first 2 days were exactly what I needed. I set up camp quickly, managing to unfold a wobbly chair without losing a finger, a personal victory considering my track record with DIY projects. I hiked through dense woods, fished at a nearby creek, and even managed to catch a trout big enough to brag about. At night, I'd sit by the campfire, drink a cold beer, and let the quiet wash over me. It was the kind of quiet that makes you feel small in the best way, like the forest itself was holding you in its arms. But by the third night, the forest didn't feel so welcoming. The silence wasn't soothing anymore. It was heavy, almost oppressive. When the wind blew through the trees, I thought I heard whispers. At first, I laughed it off. Maybe I'd been alone too long. Or maybe I was spooking myself because it was so dark out there. But then on the morning of the fourth day, I found boot prints circling my RV. Big ones. The kind a grown man would leave. And that's when I realized I wasn't alone. On the morning of the fourth day, I stepped outside the RV to stretch and enjoy the crisp mountain air. That's when I saw them. Boot prints, large and unmistakably human, pressed into the dirt around my RV. They weren't mine. I always took the same path to the creek and back, and these prints didn't match. My stomach knotted as I counted them, circling the RV once, then twice. Whoever had been here wasn't just passing through. They'd been watching. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was a park ranger checking up on things. Maybe I'd missed the prints earlier, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There wasn't a ranger station for miles, and the prints were fresh, the kind that the early morning dew hadn't yet softened. I decided to keep busy, telling myself it was nothing. I packed a small bag and hiked to the creek, where I spent the better part of the morning fishing and pretending I wasn't unnerved. But every crack of a twig in the distance made me whip my head around. Every rustle of the bushes felt like a warning. By the time I headed back to the RV, I'd worked myself into a quiet paranoia. When I returned, things felt off. Nothing was out of place, but the air around the campsite was heavier, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I brushed it off and started making lunch, but as I sat in my folding chair, chewing on a dry sandwich, I noticed something new, a note. It was tucked under the windshield wiper of the RV, written on a torn piece of notebook paper. The message was scrawled in jagged handwriting that looked rushed. Asterisk leave. Asterisk I froze, the sandwich falling from my hands. My first thought was that it had to be some kind of prank, maybe kids messing around. But I hadn't seen a single person in days. The nearest campground was at least 10 miles away. Who would go to all that trouble just to scare me? And why? I locked the RV door that night, something I hadn't bothered to do before. I sat in the dark with a flashlight in one hand and a wrench in the other, listening to the forest. Hours passed, and I started to think I'd let my imagination get the better of me. That was until just after midnight. At first, it was faint, a soft crunch of leaves. Then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the RV again. My heart pounded as I moved to the window, barely daring to peek through the blinds. There he was, the man, the same one I'd seen outside days earlier, with the long scar running from his cheek to his neck. He stood just beyond the glow of the moonlight, staring directly at the RV. That same twisted grin stretched across his face. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. Whoever he was, he wasn't here by accident. The next morning, I woke up bleary-eyed, every muscle tense from a night spent gripping that wrench. The man was gone, or at least I hoped he was. I stepped out of the RV cautiously, scanning the treeline for any sign of him. The campsite was eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that makes your skin crawl. The boot prints were there again, fresher this time, leading away from the RV and into the forest. My gut told me to pack up and leave, but my pride kept me rooted. I wasn't about to let some lunatic scare me off. By midday, I decided to take a hike to clear my head. Maybe some movement would shake off the unease. The Adirondack trails were beautiful, with towering pines and the scent of earth and moss filling the air. But even the beauty couldn't calm my nerves. Every shadow felt like it was watching me. Every crack of a branch made me jump. That's when I saw him. He was standing in the middle of the trail about 20 yards ahead, just as still as the trees around him. His clothes were worn and filthy, his scar glinting in the dappled sunlight. For a moment, neither of us moved. My heart hammered in my chest as I forced out a shaky, "Hey there, can I help you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head like he was studying me, his grin widening. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he finally said, his voice raspy and cold. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "I was just heading back to my RV. Nice meeting you." I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, his voice stopped me. The forest doesn't like strangers. It has a way of keeping people who don't belong. My blood ran cold. I glanced back, but he was gone, just vanished into the trees like he'd never been there. My heart pounded as I quickened my pace, every instinct screaming to get back to the RV. The trail felt longer than before, the forest darker. When I finally reached my campsite, I locked the RV door and sat trembling in the silence, gripping that wrench tighter than ever. Whatever was going on out here, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the driver's seat of the RV, staring out into the pitch-black forest. The scarred man's words played over and over in my head. Asterisk, the forest doesn't like strangers. Asterisk, what did that even mean? Was he warning me? Threatening me? My grip tightened around the wrench in my lap as I tried to convince myself it was just some backwoods drifter messing with me. But deep down I knew better. Around midnight, the forest came alive with noise. It started with the rustle of leaves, then the faint snap of twigs. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling the RV again. My pulse quickened as I grabbed the flashlight and aimed it toward the window. I scanned the tree line, but saw nothing, just the endless darkness pressing in. Then came the first bang, a loud, metallic thud against the side of the RV. I jumped, nearly dropping the flashlight. Another bang followed, this time harder, as though someone or something was testing the walls. My breath hitched as I backed away from the window, wrench in hand. "Come out!" A voice rasped from outside. It was him, the scarred man. His tone was calm, almost playful, but it sent chills down my spine. "You can't hide in there forever." My stomach dropped as the RV rocked slightly, the door handle rattling violently. He was trying to get in. My mind raced as I backed toward the kitchen, searching for something, anything, I could use to defend myself. My eyes landed on a cast-iron skillet. Not much, but it'd have to do. The door burst open with a deafening crack, wood splintering as the scarred man stepped inside. He held a rusted crowbar in one hand, his twisted grin stretching even wider. "Told you the forest doesn't like strangers," he said, taking a step toward me. I didn't think. I just swung. The skillet connected with his arm, and he let out a grunt of pain, stumbling back. But he wasn't done. He lunged at me, swinging the crowbar wildly. I ducked, feeling the whoosh of air as it barely missed my head. Adrenaline surged as I shoved him hard, sending him crashing into the table. For a moment, I thought I had the upper hand. But then I heard movement outside, more footsteps. My blood turned to ice as another man appeared in the doorway, this one younger and bulkier, holding a hunting knife. "Looks like you made a friend," he sneered. I was outnumbered, trapped. The scarred man recovered quickly, lunging at me again. This time, he tackled me to the ground, the crowbar inches from my face. I struggled, kicking and thrashing, finally landing a solid hit to his ribs. He groaned and loosened his grip just enough for me to roll away. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the wrench I dropped. The younger man advanced, slashing the air with his knife. I swung the wrench wildly, managing to knock the blade out of his hand. He cursed, clutching his wrist. But before I could press my advantage, the scarred man grabbed me from behind. I thrashed and twisted, managing to elbow him hard in the stomach. He let go, and I bolted for the door. The younger man tried to block me, but I barreled into him, knocking him off balance. I stumbled out of the RV and into the night, my legs burning as I ran into the forest. Behind me, I could hear them shouting, their footsteps pounding against the dirt as they gave chase. My lungs screamed for air, my vision blurred with panic. But I couldn't stop. If I did, I knew I wouldn't survive. The forest swallowed me whole, and the hunt began. The forest was a blur of shadows and moonlight as I sprinted through the underbrush, my breath ragged and chest burning. Behind me, their shouts echoed, growing louder with each passing second. I didn't dare look back. Every step felt heavier, the adrenaline surging through me like a lifeline. I had no plan, just one thought looping in my head. Keep running. The trees seemed endless, the darkness thicker than it should have been. My foot caught on a root, sending me sprawling to the ground. Pain shot up my leg, but I forced myself to move, crawling behind a fallen log. I pressed my back against the rough bark, clutching the wrench so tightly my knuckles turned white. My breath was shallow, quiet, as I strained to hear their footsteps. They were close. Spread out, one of them barked. He couldn't have gone far. I peeked over the log, my heart hammering as I spotted the scarred man. His crowbar gleamed in the faint light, his eyes scanning the shadows like a predator. I needed a distraction, something to lead them away. My mechanic instincts kicked in. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my lighter. Grabbing a nearby branch, I wrapped it in my shirt and lit it. The flames flickered weakly, but it was enough. I hurled it toward a dense patch of bushes. The crackling fire and sudden light startled them. There, one of them shouted, charging toward the noise. While they were distracted, I crawled deeper into the woods. My body screamed for rest, but I couldn't stop, not yet. I stumbled across a narrow creek, using the cold water to mask my trail. The shouts grew fainter, the forest swallowing their voices. For the first time, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe I'd make it out alive. Hours later, I stumbled onto a dirt road, my body aching and my mind on the verge of collapse. The night was quiet now, but every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through me. I had no idea where I was, but the road meant civilization, or at least safety, wasn't far. I followed it, limping with every step until the faint glow of headlights appeared in the distance. A truck came into view, and I waved it down with every ounce of strength I had left. The driver, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, jumped out the moment he saw me. "What the hell happened to you?" he asked, taking in my torn clothes and bloodied face. "Call the police," I gasped. "They're still out there." By the time the authorities arrived, the scarred man and his accomplice were long gone. A search of the area turned up my RV, trashed and ransacked, but thankfully intact. Nearby, they found signs of other campsites. Tents slashed open, belongings scattered. The officers said they'd been investigating a string of disappearances in the Adirondacks, all tied to a pair of drifters matching the descriptions I gave. The scarred man, they said, was known as Peter Grayson, a wanted fugitive with a violent history. His accomplice, no name, just another shadow in the dark. Despite their efforts, the two vanished without a trace, melting back into the wilderness. I returned home shaken but alive, vowing never to camp alone again. The Adirondacks, once a peaceful escape, had become a place I'd never visit again. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the sound of footsteps circling outside my window. I tell myself it's my imagination, but deep down I know better. Some things in the woods are best left undiscovered. You ever wake up to something that makes your stomach drop, like the world around you isn't as safe as you thought? That's how it started for me. Big Bend National Park was supposed to be my escape. Miles of untamed desert, towering canyons, and not a soul in sight. I'd parked my RV in a secluded spot by the Rio Grande, where the silence was so thick you could feel it pressing against your ears. Peaceful, right? Not that morning. I stepped outside to stretch, expecting nothing but the usual sunrise over the canyon walls. Instead, I found strange symbols carved into the side of my RV, lines, spirals, and shapes I couldn't make sense of. They hadn't been there when I went to bed, and I sure as hell didn't put them there. As I stood there, trying to piece it together, something caught my eye. A faint flicker of light on the ridge above. It was quick, like the reflection off a mirror, but enough to send a shiver down my spine. I wasn't alone, and whoever, or whatever, was out there had been close enough to touch my RV while I slept. That was just the beginning. My name's Lucas Grayson. Back in 2016, I was a history teacher looking for a little adventure, or maybe just a way to escape the grind. Between endless papers to grade and PTA meetings full of parents with too much to say, I needed a break. So, when summer rolled around, I packed up my old RV, a few cans of beans, a guitar I hadn't touched in years, and a stack of books I swore I'd read. My destination? Big Bend National Park in Texas. Big Bend had always been on my bucket list. It's one of those places that feels untouched by time, where the desert stretches for miles, the canyons rise like walls guarding ancient secrets, and the Rio Grande winds through it all like a shimmering thread. It wasn't just beautiful, it was remote. That's what I wanted most. Solitude. No Wi-Fi, no emails, no students with excuses about their homework. Just me, the open road, and the wild. When I got to the park, I skipped the official campgrounds. Too many rules and too many people. Instead, I drove down a dusty trail until I found the perfect spot, a flat patch of ground near the river, surrounded by jagged cliffs that seemed to rise endlessly into the sky. It was breathtaking. No signs of other campers, no sounds except the wind whistling through the canyon walls. Perfect. The first couple of days were pure bliss. I hiked along the riverbank, snapping photos of the dramatic landscapes and soaking up the sun. At night, I'd light a small campfire, crack open a beer, and strum a few chords on my guitar, listening as the sound echoed off the canyon walls. I felt like I'd stepped into another world, one where I could finally breathe. But by the third night, something shifted. The silence didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt heavy, like the desert itself was holding its breath. The wind didn't whistle. It whispered, low and strange, like voices just out of earshot. And then there was a light, faint, flickering on the ridge above me, too far to make out clearly, but close enough to unsettle me. I told myself it was nothing, just a camper with a flashlight, but deep down I knew better. The desert felt different now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. By the third night, the desert started to feel off. It wasn't just a silence, though that had changed too. What used to feel calming now felt oppressive, like the stillness was waiting for something. The wind carried strange sounds, whispers maybe, or was it just the way it twisted through the canyon walls? I couldn't tell. All I knew was that the sense of peace I'd felt on my first day was gone, replaced by an uneasiness I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the sounds, either. That night, as I sat by the campfire, I caught something in my peripheral vision, a flicker of light up on the ridge. It wasn't constant, more like a spark or a brief flash, but it made my stomach tighten. I told myself it was probably another camper, maybe someone with a headlamp. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The thought gnawed at me as I climbed into the RV to sleep, locking the door for the first time since I'd arrived. The next morning, I decided to clear my head with a hike along the riverbank. The air was crisp, and the scenery was straight out of a postcard. But even as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every now and then, I'd stop, glancing over my shoulder at the cliffs behind me. Nothing, no movement, no sound, just the endless expanse of rock and sky. Still, the feeling persisted. About an hour into my hike, I stumbled across something that made me stop in my tracks. It was an old, weathered campsite, a torn tent, scattered belongings, and what looked like the remnants of a fire pit. At first, I thought it was just abandoned, but the state of the tent made me think otherwise. It had been slashed open, the cuts jagged and uneven, as though someone had done it in a hurry or out of anger. Among the debris, I found a notebook. It was damp and fraying at the edges, the kind of thing you'd expect someone to toss after years of use. But curiosity got the better of me, and I flipped through the pages. The name, Victor Delgado, was written on the inside cover, along with a date 2 weeks prior. Most of the entries were mundane, notes about the weather, sketches of the surrounding area. But the final few pages were different. Victor had written about strange symbols he'd found etched into the walls of a nearby cave. He described them as ancient, almost ritualistic, with patterns that seemed deliberate. His last entry, dated 2 days before the journal was left behind, sent a chill down my spine. Asterisk, I feel like I'm being watched. The light on the ridge hasn't moved all night. Asterisk, I shut the notebook and glanced around the ruined campsite, half expecting someone or something to step out from behind the rocks. The desert felt heavier than ever, the stillness pressing down on me. I stuffed the journal into my bag and headed back to my RV, my pulse quickening with every step. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt it too. I was being watched. By the fourth day, my unease had grown into full-blown paranoia. Every sound, every shadow felt like a threat. Victor Delgado's journal haunted me. The strange symbols, the feeling of being watched, the flickering light on the ridge. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking the same path he had, and we all know how his story ended. A slashed tent and an abandoned campsite. I couldn't ignore the journal. The mention of nearby caves and the strange carvings pulled at me like a dare I didn't want to take but couldn't resist. Around midday, I packed a flashlight, water, and my wrench, just in case, and set out to find the caves Victor had described. The hike was grueling, the desert heat bearing down on me as I climbed toward the ridge where I'd seen the light. The path was unmarked, overgrown, and eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves. Just my labored breathing and the crunch of my boots against the rocky terrain. When I finally found the caves, I hesitated at the entrance. The air was cooler here, almost cold, and carried a strange dampness that didn't belong in the desert. I switched on my flashlight and stepped. Inside, the beam cutting through the darkness. The walls of the cave were covered in carvings, symbols just like the ones Victor had described in his journal. Spirals, jagged lines, and patterns that seemed deliberate but made no sense to me. As I moved deeper into the cave, I noticed other things, signs that someone else had been here. A broken flashlight lay discarded near the entrance, its batteries long dead. A sleeping bag was stuffed into a corner, torn and dirty. And then near the far wall, I found something carved into the rock, asterisk turned back. Asterisk, the letters were crude, as if carved with a shaking hand, and the words filled me with a dread I couldn't explain. The air felt heavier the longer I stayed, like the walls were closing in on me. My flashlight flickered once, twice, then went out completely. Panic surged through me as I fumbled with it, but I didn't have time to fix it. I wasn't alone in that cave. I didn't see anything, but I felt it, a presence, silent and suffocating. I bolted, stumbling over loose rocks as I scrambled out into the blinding sunlight. My heart was racing, my hands trembling. Whatever I'd just experienced, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't supposed to be there. That night, the desert was eerily silent, as if the land itself was waiting for something to happen. My RV felt smaller than ever, its walls thin and useless against the vast emptiness outside. I sat by the small table, Victor Delgado's journal open in front of me, reading his final entries again and again. The cave, the carvings, the warning etched into the rock. Asterisk turn back. Asterisk's words haunted me. Asterisk, I feel like I'm being watched. The light on the ridge hasn't moved all night. Asterisk, I glanced toward the ridge through the small RV window. And there it was, the light. A faint flicker in the distance, barely visible but unmistakable. My stomach dropped. I'd hiked to that ridge earlier. There was no campsite, no path, nothing but rock and dust. Whoever was up there wasn't camping. They were watching. I locked the RV door and double-checked the windows, my pulse quickening. My wrench sat next to me, its cold weight oddly comforting. Hours passed, the light on the ridge remaining in its silent vigil. Then, just after midnight, I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the RV. My breath caught. I grabbed the wrench and stood, every nerve in my body, screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The footsteps stopped near the driver's side door. A low tapping followed, a sound so soft it was almost polite. It sent a chill down my spine. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice shaking. The tapping stopped. Silence. Then came the banging, loud, violent, as if someone was trying to rip the door off its hinges. I stumbled backward, clutching the wrench so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Leave me alone!" I yelled, but the pounding only grew louder. The RV rocked under the force of the blows. Through the window, I caught a glimpse of something, a shadowy figure darting past, too fast to make out any details. My heart raced as I tried to think. If they got inside, I wouldn't stand a chance. The banging suddenly stopped. The silence was worse. My breathing was loud in my ears, my pulse pounding. I crept to the window and peered outside. Nothing, just the empty desert, bathed in moonlight. For a moment, I let myself believe it was over. Then I saw it. A small object lay on the ground outside the RV, just visible in the moonlight. I opened the window cautiously, shining my flashlight on it. It was a totem, hand-carved from wood, with strange symbols etched into its surface. The same symbols I'd seen in the cave. My throat went dry. The footsteps started again, closer this time. I backed away from the window, my eyes darting around the RV. A shadow passed by, then another. There wasn't just one person out there. There were several. My chest tightened as I realized they were surrounding me. The RV shook violently as something slammed against it. The windows rattled, and I heard voices, low, guttural, and unintelligible. Fear clawed at my chest as I realized they were speaking in a language I didn't recognize. My mind raced. I had to get out. Gripping the wrench, I edged toward the driver's seat. Just as I reached for the keys, the windshield cracked, a spiderweb of fractures spreading from a single impact. My hand froze midair as I looked up to see a face staring at me through the glass. Pale, gaunt, and emotionless. That was it. I turned the key, the engine roaring to life. The figures outside started pounding on the RV, their fists slamming against the walls. The totem lay forgotten, on the ground as I threw the RV into gear and hit the gas. The tires spun in the dirt before catching, the RV lurching forward. In the side mirror I saw them, at least 4 figures, chasing after me. One of them carried something long, like a staff or spear, and waved it in the air as they ran. The light on the ridge blinked out, plunging the desert into complete darkness behind me. I didn't stop driving until the horizon turned gray with dawn. The RV roared down the dusty road, the wheels skidding on loose gravel as I struggled to keep it steady. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. The cracked windshield distorted the view, but I didn't care. I just needed to get as far from that ridge as possible. In the rear view mirror, I could still see them. 4 figures, their movements unnatural, almost jerky, chasing after me with relentless determination. One of them carried a long staff, its silhouette stark against the moonlit desert. I pushed the accelerator harder, the RV groaning as it picked up speed. My heart raced, every beat louder than the roar of the engine. The road twisted sharply, and I nearly lost control as the RV skidded dangerously close to the edge of a steep drop. Dust and rocks kicked up into the air, obscuring my pursuers for a moment. When I glanced in the mirror again, the figures had stopped. They stood in a line, watching, their forms fading into the night. For a fleeting moment, I thought I was safe. Then the headlights appeared, bright, blinding, and far too close. A vehicle sped toward me from behind. My stomach twisted. Whoever was driving wasn't trying to help. They were pushing me, forcing me faster down the dangerous road. The headlights swerved side to side, edging closer like a predator toying with its prey. I could feel the RV lurching, the engine straining under the pressure. In a last desperate move, I veered sharply to the left, sending the RV onto a narrow side path I hadn't even noticed before. The pursuing vehicle shot past me, its lights disappearing into the darkness. I didn't stop driving until I reached the safety of the nearest town, my entire body trembling. The town was small, just a gas station, a diner, and a handful of buildings scattered along the main road. I pulled into the gas station, parking the RV under the harsh glow of a single fluorescent light. My hands were still shaking as I stumbled out, desperate for human contact, for safety. The attendant looked up from behind the counter, startled by the state of me, dust-covered, sweat-soaked, and wide-eyed with terror. "You okay, man?" he asked, his voice cautious. "Call the sheriff," I managed to say. "There's someone out there." As I waited, I told him what had happened, though my words came out fragmented. I showed him Victor Delgado's journal and described the symbols, the figures, the totem. He didn't laugh or call me crazy. Instead, his face grew pale. "You're not the first," he muttered, almost to himself. The sheriff arrived within the hour. I recounted everything again, from the strange light on the ridge to the chase. He listened in silence, his expression grim. When I finished, he sighed and leaned against his cruiser. "You should have stayed at the main campgrounds," he said. "We've had reports of disappearances out in that area. The park's too big to patrol and, well, some things we can't explain." They took the journal, promising to investigate, but I could see it in their eyes. They didn't expect to find anything, and they didn't. Days later, I got a call from the sheriff's office. No signs of the figures, no vehicle tracks, nothing. I returned home, shaken but alive. The RV stayed parked in my driveway, a silent reminder of what happened. Weeks later, as I walked to my front door, I froze. Sitting on the porch was a totem, carved with the same strange symbols. I moved out the next day. You ever see something so wrong, your brain refuses to believe it? That's exactly how it started for me. I was camping alone by the main coastline, parked in a quiet clearing near the cliffs. The view was stunning. Waves crashing below, pine trees swaying in the wind, and not a soul for miles. It was the kind of isolation I'd been craving after a stressful year. But then I saw it. I was sitting by the fire, staring out toward the trees, when I noticed something, a figure. It was standing just beyond the tree line, too far to see clearly but close enough to know it wasn't right. It didn't move, didn't shift, didn't even sway in the breeze like a person naturally would. It was unnaturally still, like it was waiting. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, maybe a tree stump or a shadow cast by the moon. But when I blinked, it was gone. Just gone. That should have been my cue to pack up and leave. But I didn't. I stayed. And that night, I realized the figure hadn't disappeared. It had only gotten closer. My name's Jason Carter. Back in the summer of 1998, I decided to take a solo camping trip to Maine's rugged coastline. I'd just come off a brutal year. A stressful job as a graphic designer, long hours, and not enough time to breathe. I needed a break, a chance to clear my head and unplug from the world. Maine seemed like the perfect place to do that. The coastline was everything I'd hoped for and more. Jagged cliffs plunging into the ocean, pine forests that stretched forever, and the kind of salty air that made you feel alive. I wanted solitude, and I got it. My RV was parked in a clearing just a few hundred feet from the edge of the cliffs, with nothing but the sound of waves crashing below to keep me company. The spot wasn't an official campground. It was a little out of the way, off a dirt road I'd found on my map, perfect for someone looking to escape. The first couple of days were incredible. I spent my mornings exploring tide pools, marveling at the strange sea creatures tucked among the rocks. In the afternoons, I'd sit by the fire pit I'd made, reading or sketching while the ocean breeze cooled the summer heat. At night, the stars lit up the sky like a scene from a postcard, and the sound of the waves lulled me to sleep. But even as I settled into the peace and quiet, something about the place felt heavy. The air in the forest behind my RV was different, still and thick, like it was holding its breath. At first, I chalked it up to being alone for the first time in years. But by the third night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It started small, faint rustling in the woods at odd hours, footprints in the sand near my campsite that weren't mine. And then there was the feeling, the one that prickled the back of my neck whenever I turned my back to the forest. I told myself it was all in my head. After all, it was just me out there, right? At least, that's what I wanted to believe. The feeling of being watched grew stronger on my third night, and I started noticing things I couldn't explain. It began with the footprints, faint impressions in the sand just outside my RV. They weren't mine. The treads were wider, the steps heavier. At first, I thought maybe someone had wandered by while I was asleep, but that didn't make sense. I was parked miles from any trail or campground, and the clearing wasn't exactly easy to find. I tried to ignore it and distract myself. The next day, I took my kayak down to the beach, eager to explore the coastline from the water. The ocean was calm, the cliffs towering above me like ancient sentinels. I paddled for hours, enjoying the freedom and silence. But as I rounded a bend near a rocky outcrop, I saw something tangled in the driftwood ahead, a backpack. Curious, I paddled closer and hauled it into the kayak. The fabric was torn and waterlogged, but it was heavy, as if something was still inside. Back on shore, I emptied the contents onto the sand. a broken flashlight, some faded maps, and a small, battered journal. The journal's pages were warped and smeared, but I could make out a few entries. The first ones were normal enough. Notes about hiking routes, weather conditions, and sketches of the cliffs. But the later entries were different. The handwriting grew frantic, almost illegible, with phrases like, "It's watching me," and asterisk, "I see it at the tree line every night." Asterisk, one line stood out, sending a chill down my spine. Asterisk, "It doesn't move until I do." Asterisk, I closed the journal and stared at the dense forest behind my RV. The person who wrote this, who were they, and why had they abandoned their backpack on the beach? That night, I couldn't shake the journal's words. I sat by the fire, scanning the trees every few minutes, waiting for, I didn't even know what. The rustling in the woods was louder now, like something moving just out of sight. Around midnight, the fire was burning low, and I was on the verge of calling it a night when I saw it. Near the tree line, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure. My chest tightened as I squinted to make it out. It wasn't moving, just standing there completely still. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but the figure was gone. My stomach churned as I scanned the area, finding nothing but the swaying pines. I told myself it was a shadow or a trick of the light, but deep down I knew better. Something was out there, watching. When I climbed into the RV that night, I locked the door and drew the blinds. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it was restless and filled with the feeling that I wasn't alone. By morning, I decided I needed answers. If I was going to stay here another night, I had to know what was in those woods. The next morning, I woke up determined to figure out what was going on. The unease from the night before still clung to me like a shadow, but I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. I grabbed my flashlight, a water bottle, and the wrench I kept in the RV for repairs, just in case, and set off into the woods behind my campsite. The forest was dense, the kind where sunlight barely filters through the canopy. Every step I took seemed to echo, the crunch of leaves and twigs unnaturally loud in the heavy silence. About 20 minutes in, I stumbled upon something odd. At first, it looked like a natural clearing, but as I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't. The ground was littered with strange piles of rocks, each one carefully stacked and arranged in odd patterns. Some formed spirals. Others were simple towers. The trees surrounding the clearing had markings carved into their bark, symbols I didn't recognize. Spirals, jagged lines, and shapes that seemed to flow into each other. They reminded me of the ones described in the journal I'd found. In the center of the clearing was a makeshift campsite. An old tent, collapsed and torn, sat near a blackened fire pit. Rusted cans and scraps of fabric were scattered around, but there was no sign of whoever had been there. It looked like it had been abandoned for weeks, maybe months. I knelt by the fire pit and noticed something half buried in the ashes. Pulling it free, I realized it was a knife. Its blade was dull and rusted, but the handle was wrapped in fraying leather. Carved into the leather were more symbols, matching those on the trees. My chest tightened as I stared at it. Whoever had been here, they hadn't just left. Something had driven them away. The air in the clearing was thick, oppressive, like it was pressing down on me. I felt an overwhelming urge to leave, to get back to the safety of my RV. As I stood, a faint rustling sound came from deeper in the woods. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, steady, like footsteps. I didn't wait to find out who or what it was. Clutching the knife, I hurried back toward my campsite. The feeling of being watched stronger with every step. That night, the forest felt alive in the worst way possible. The usual soothing rhythm of waves crashing against the cliffs was drowned out by the oppressive silence of the woods. Even with the RV locked up tight, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the vehicle felt like a warning, every shadow outside a threat. I sat at the small dining table, the knife I'd found earlier resting in front of me. Its strange, hand-carved symbols seemed to hum with a silent weight. My flashlight and wrench sat nearby, my only tools if things went wrong. Deep down, I already knew they would. Around midnight, the first sound came. A faint tap-tap-tap on the RV door, so soft I almost didn't hear it. My stomach tightened as I froze, straining to listen. The tapping came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps circling the RV. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. My voice echoed in the confined space, but there was no answer. I grabbed the flashlight and peered out the window. At first, I saw nothing, just the dark outline of trees swaying gently in the breeze. But then I saw it, the figure. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows. Its posture was unnervingly rigid, its head tilted slightly, as if it was studying me. I blinked, and it was gone. Panic surged as I backed away from the window. My mind raced. Was it a person? Something else? Either way, I was alone and they, or it, knew exactly where I was. The RV rocked suddenly and I stumbled, catching myself on the table. Something, or someone, was banging against the side, harder this time. I grabbed the wrench, holding it like a weapon, as the banging moved toward the door. The handle rattled violently, and my breath caught in my throat. The door burst open with a loud crack, the flimsy lock giving way. I scrambled back, clutching the wrench as the figure stepped inside. Its face was partially obscured by the dim light, but what I saw chilled me to the core. The skin was pale and gaunt, the eyes hollow and empty. It didn't look entirely human, like something had warped it into what it was now. "Get out!" I shouted, swinging the wrench wildly. The figure didn't flinch. It moved closer, its steps slow and deliberate, as if it had all the time in the world. I swung again, this time connecting with its arm. The figure staggered back slightly, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it let out a low, guttural sound, somewhere between a growl and a laugh. My chest tightened as I realized I couldn't fight it off forever. Thinking fast, I grabbed the knife from the table and lunged toward the figure. It dodged, its movements unnaturally quick, and I stumbled past it, heading for the driver's seat. My only chance was to get the RV moving. As I fumbled with the keys, the figure slammed into the side of the RV again, harder this time. The whole vehicle shook as I jammed the key into the ignition, my hands trembling. The engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas. Through the windshield, I saw the figure standing in the middle of the clearing, motionless once again. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine as the RV lurched forward, the tires kicking up dirt and gravel. The last thing I saw before I turned onto the main road was the figure, standing perfectly still at the edge of the clearing, its twisted silhouette illuminated by the moonlight. It wasn't chasing me anymore. It didn't have to. It knew I'd never come back. The RV roared down the dirt road, headlights cutting through the thick darkness. My hands gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white, every bump and turn jarring my already frayed nerves. Behind me, the clearing and that thing were swallowed by the shadows, but I couldn't shake the feeling it was still watching. The road was narrow, lined with towering pines that loomed like silent sentinels. I kept glancing in the rear-view mirror, half expecting to see the figure chasing me, its pale face illuminated by the taillights. But there was nothing, just the empty, twisting road behind me. Relief began to creep in, but it was short-lived. A loud thud echoed from the roof of the RV, followed by the sound of something heavy sliding across the metal. My heart stopped. I glanced up at the ceiling, my pulse pounding in my ears. Not possible, I muttered to myself. But the sound came again, a deliberate scrape, as though something was dragging itself toward the front of the RV. Panic surged as I swerved, the RV veering dangerously close to the edge of the road. The scraping stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I floored the gas, desperate to reach the main road. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the trees thinned and the dirt road gave way to asphalt. I could see the faint glow of streetlights in the distance, and my chest loosened for the first time in hours. Whatever had been following me wasn't here anymore. Or so I thought. As I slowed the RV near the first gas station I'd seen, I caught movement in the corner of my eye, a figure, standing at the edge of the woods, completely still, watching. I didn't stop. I just kept driving. I didn't stop driving until the sun crept over the horizon, painting the sky with soft hues of orange and pink. Exhausted, I finally pulled into a diner parking lot, surrounded by the safety of civilization. My hands were still trembling as I stepped out of the RV, every nerve in my body frayed. I stumbled inside, ordered a coffee, and tried to piece together what had just happened. After a few minutes, I called the local sheriff's office. The deputy on duty listened patiently as I described everything. The footprints, the strange markings in the woods, the figure that had chased me. When I finished, there was a long pause before he finally spoke. "You're not the first to report something like this," he said, his tone careful. "That stretch of coastline has a reputation. We've had hikers and campers go missing there over the years. Some say it's the isolation. Others think there's more to it. But we never find anything." The words didn't comfort me. They only confirmed what I already felt. That whatever I'd encountered wasn't something the authorities could explain or protect me from. I drove home that same day, abandoning any plans of finishing my trip. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep, jolting awake at the slightest sound. The image of that figure standing at the edge of the woods was burned into my mind. Months later, I found the knife I'd taken from the clearing buried under some gear in the RV. Its strange symbols seemed to hum with the same eerie energy I'd felt in the woods. Without hesitation, I tossed it into the nearest river. I haven't been back to Maine since. Some places, I've learned, are meant to be left alone. You ever wake up in the dead of night and realize you're not alone? That's exactly what happened to me during my solo RV trip in Olympic National Park. It was just after midnight, and the only sounds outside were the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional creak of my RV settling into the dirt. I'd parked deep in the forest, miles from any campground, thinking I'd found the perfect escape. Then I heard it, a faint tapping on the window, so soft I almost thought I imagined it. My first thought was a branch swaying in the breeze, brushing against the glass. But the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and grabbed the flashlight sitting on the counter. When I shined it toward the window, my stomach dropped. Standing just outside, half hidden by the shadows, was a man. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes were sunken and hollow. But it was a smile that froze me in place, a twisted grin that stretched too wide to be natural. He didn't move. He just stared at me, his head tilting slightly, like he was studying me. That was my first encounter with him, and it was only the beginning. My name's Eric Daniels, and if there's one thing I've always loved, it's hitting the road. There's nothing quite like the freedom of packing up an RV, leaving the chaos of the city behind, and driving straight into the wild. No deadlines, no sirens, no endless buzzing of phones. Just me, the open road, and the kind of silence that lets you think. Back in the fall of 2015, I planned what I thought would be the ultimate getaway. A week-long solo trip through the forests of Oregon, Northern California, and Washington, with my final stop at a remote campground in Olympic National Park. I'd mapped out every detail, from the trails I wanted to hike to the spots I'd park my RV for the night. It was going to be perfect, a reset button for my mind after months of stressful 12-hour shifts as a paramedic. The first couple of days went exactly as planned. I started in the dense, misty woods of Oregon, where the air smelled like pine and rain. From there, I made my way into Northern California, marveling at the towering redwoods that made me feel like a tiny speck in an ancient world. Everywhere I stopped, I found little moments of peace. The quiet crunch of leaves under my boots, the hum of insects in the stillness, the crackle of a fire as I sat under a blanket of stars. But as the trip went on, something started to feel off. It was subtle at first, small things I could almost explain away. A tree with the words "Keep Out" carved into the bark, deep boot prints circling my RV in the morning, and that gnawing feeling at the back of my neck, like I wasn't as alone as I thought. By the time I reached Olympic National Park, the unease had settled into my chest like a weight. The locals in a nearby town had warned me about the area, muttering something about disappearances and a drifter named Victor Reynolds. They called him a legend, a story meant to scare tourists. I laughed it off, thinking it was just small-town superstition. But now, looking back, I wish I'd listened. If I had, maybe I would have left before the forest showed me its darkest secrets. By the time I pulled into Olympic National Park, the air felt different, heavier, almost oppressive. The forest was beautiful, but it wasn't the peaceful sanctuary I'd imagined. The towering trees seemed to close in around me, their gnarled branches twisting into unnatural shapes. It felt like the kind of place that didn't want to be disturbed. Still, I told myself I was being ridiculous. I parked my RV in a small, secluded clearing off a narrow dirt road, far from the main camping areas. It was quiet, just the way I liked it, with the trees providing plenty of cover and a small stream nearby. I set up a fire pit, cooked a simple dinner, and tried to shake the strange feeling in my gut. That night, the first thing happened. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard something, a faint rustling outside the RV. I froze, my ears straining to make sense of the sound. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, like someone or something was moving through the underbrush. I sat up and grabbed the flashlight from the counter. Shining it out the window, I saw nothing but darkness. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. The next morning, I stepped outside to find deep boot prints circling the RV. They weren't mine. The treads were wider and heavier than the hiking boots I wore. I crouched down to examine them, my chest tightening as I traced the path. Whoever had made them had walked around the RV twice before disappearing into the trees. I told myself it had to be a ranger or maybe another camper. But why wouldn't they knock or say something? Why would they just circle? Later that day, I decided to stretch my legs and explore the forest. I didn't wander far, just followed the stream a couple of hundred yards, enjoying the crisp autumn air. That's when I noticed it. A single tree with the words "Keep Out" carved deep into its bark. The letters were uneven, jagged, as if whoever had done it was in a hurry. I scanned the area, my pulse quickening. There was no sign of anyone nearby, no voices or footsteps, just the eerie stillness of the forest. The phrase felt more like a warning than a joke. That night, the whispers began. It was faint at first, almost like the breeze was playing tricks on me. But as the hours dragged on, the sound grew clearer. Low, guttural voices, murmuring words I couldn't understand. I sat up in bed, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline, my heart pounding. The whispers seemed to come from every direction, circling the RV just like those boot prints. When I finally dared to look outside, the forest was empty. The whispers stopped the moment I opened the blinds, leaving behind a silence so thick it was suffocating. I should have left then. Every instinct screamed at me to pack up and go. But I didn't, and that was my biggest mistake. The next morning, I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. The whispers, the boot prints, the eerie feeling that I wasn't alone. It all felt too deliberate to dismiss. I decided to explore deeper into the forest, hoping to find some kind of explanation. Armed with a flashlight, a water bottle, and a wrench I kept in the RV for emergencies, I headed out. The forest seemed darker than it should have been, even under the mid-morning sun. The trees were dense, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the light. As I walked, the only sounds were my boots crunching against the leaves and the occasional rustle of wind through the pines. It was unsettlingly quiet. No birds, no animals, just the silence pressing in on me. About half an hour into my hike, I stumbled upon a clearing. At first glance, it looked like any other patch of forest, but as I stepped closer, I noticed strange details. Rocks had been stacked in unnatural piles, some in spirals, others forming crude towers. The trees around the clearing were marked with deep carvings, symbols I didn't recognize, jagged spirals, intersecting lines, and shapes that look almost like eyes. In the center of the clearing, there was a tattered tent. The fabric was shredded, flapping slightly in the breeze, and the inside was a mess of torn sleeping bags, empty cans, and papers scattered across the ground. I crouched down to examine the mess and froze. Among the papers was a weathered notebook. Its cover was smeared with dirt, but the pages inside were still legible. The entries described someone's camping trip, but the tone changed halfway through. The writer mentioned hearing whispers at night, finding boot prints around their campsite, and seeing a man with a face like a corpse watching them from the trees. The last entry made my stomach drop. Asterisk, he's here. He's watching. If you find this, don't stay. Asterisk as I read those words. A branch snapped behind me. The sound was sharp, deliberate, and way too close. My blood turned to ice as I turned around, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The clearing was empty, but I knew I wasn't alone. I practically ran back to the RV, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. The notebook was clutched tightly in my hand. The final entry repeating in my mind. Asterisk, he's here. He's watching. If you find this, don't stay. Asterisk, every shadow seemed alive, every sound a warning. By the time I reached the clearing where my RV was parked, my shirt was soaked with sweat, and I was gasping for air. Slamming the door behind me, I locked it, double-checking every latch and bolt. The eerie silence of the forest pressed against the thin walls of the RV, amplifying my paranoia. I placed a notebook on the table, the scrawled entries staring back at me like a bad omen. My hands trembled as I gripped the wrench, my only real weapon if something or someone tried to get inside. It was just after midnight when it started, a faint tapping on the window. It was so soft at first that I thought it might be a branch brushing against the glass. But then it came again, louder, deliberate, like someone was knocking. I froze. My flashlight sat on the table beside me, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The tapping stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps. Slow, measured steps circling the RV. My chest tightened as I gripped the wrench, my breath shallow. "Who's there?" I finally shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. No answer, just the relentless sound of footsteps, moving closer. I gathered enough courage to peek through the small window by the door, my hands shaking. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, just at the edge of the clearing, I spotted him. He was standing motionless, his pale face illuminated by the faint glow of the moon. His eyes were hollow sunken, and his grin was so unnaturally wide it sent a chill down my spine. He tilted his head slightly, as if studying me, and raised one hand to tap his finger against his temple. Like he knew what I was thinking, like he was mocking me. I stumbled back from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps started again, moving faster this time, circling the RV. Then came the scratching, a long, deliberate scrape of metal against metal, starting at the back of the RV and moving toward the door. "Leave me alone!" I shouted, my voice cracking. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own labored breathing. Then, without warning, the RV rocked violently, like something or someone had slammed against it. I fell to the floor, clutching the wrench as the lights flickered above me. I crawled toward the driver's seat, desperate to start the engine and get out of there. But just as I reached for the keys, the side window shattered. Glass rained down around me as a pale hand reached inside, grasping for the lock. Adrenaline surged as I swung the wrench with all my strength. It connected with the hand, and a guttural growl echoed outside. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I scrambled into the driver's seat, started the engine, and slammed my foot on the gas. Through the cracked windshield, I saw him one last time, standing in the middle of the road, his head tilted, that same twisted grin on his face. As the RV roared past, his figure faded into the darkness, but his presence lingered, etched into my mind like a scar. I didn't stop driving until I saw the glow of the ranger station's lights ahead. But even now, I can still hear the sound of that tapping. I slammed the gas pedal to the floor, the RV lurching forward as its tires spat gravel into the darkness. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly they ached, and my heart pounded like a drum in my chest. Behind me, the shattered window rattled with every bump in the road, letting in the cold night air and the sound of something running. I glanced in the rear-view mirror, and my blood turned to ice. He was chasing me. His pale face flickered in and out of view as the trees blurred past, his unnatural, jerky movements faster than any person should be able to run. His twisted grin was still there, a reminder that this wasn't over. The road was narrow and uneven, every turn a fight to keep the RV from tipping. The headlights barely cut through the suffocating darkness, and the forest seemed to close in around me. In the mirror, his figure was getting closer, his arms reaching out as if he could grab the RV. "Come on, come on!" I muttered, willing the RV to go faster. The engine roared, and the vehicle lurched forward, but so did he. Finally, the trees thinned and I Saw the faint glow of lights ahead. A ranger station. Relief flooded through me as I barreled toward it, the RV skidding to a stop just outside the lot. I threw the door open and stumbled out, my voice hoarse as I shouted for help. The rangers came running, but when I turned back toward the road, he was gone. The forest was silent again, as if it had swallowed him whole. Even now, I wonder if he let me go, just so he could find me again someday. The rangers didn't laugh when I told them what had happened. They listened intently as I described the pale man, the tapping, the boot prints, and the eerie whispers in the woods. When I finished, one of them, a grizzled man with decades of experience etched into his face, nodded grimly. "You're not the first to report something like this," he said. "We've heard stories about Victor Reynolds for years. They say he's a drifter, a killer, maybe even something worse. Some people swear he's more legend than man, but you're proof enough for me he's real." The others exchanged uneasy glances before one of them spoke. "We've had campers go missing in these woods, hikers too. We find their gear sometimes, but never them. Sounds like you were lucky." "Lucky," I said, my voice shaking. "I don't feel lucky." They checked the forest that night, searching the clearing where I'd parked my RV, but found no trace of him. No footprints, no shattered glass, not even the notebook I'd left behind. It was as if the forest had erased all evidence he'd ever been there, or that I had. I left Olympic National Park the next morning, and I haven't been back since. Every time I close my eyes, I see his twisted grin, hear the sound of his fingers tapping against the glass. At night, when the wind brushes against my windows, I sometimes catch myself staring into the darkness, half expecting to see him there, waiting. I still love the road, but I've never taken another solo trip. There are things out there, things like Victor Reynolds, that don't belong in the world we know. And sometimes they're just waiting for someone to stumble into theirs.